My battery doesn't die. Thank you. All right, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started since we're at just a little bit after 4 and I don't see anybody else walking up. I don't want to keep you guys too terrible late. Thank you guys very much for coming out to see us this afternoon, even though I did have to push it a little bit later. I appreciate you guys coming. I am also recording this, and hopefully with my little microphone here, it'll be able to pick up everything much better than when we tried to record classes last year. So we'll go ahead and get started here. My introduction. It was a dark and stormy night. You're a customer holding a ticket to tear in the corn haunted house. You drive onto the property and you see a carnival atmosphere of fun. People, food trucks, face painters, music. You're ready for a good time. You step into line for terror and you dance to Turn Down for What while you listen to DJ Bones and MC Ribs quip back and forth with one another. You're set for a fun experience. Your time comes to enter Demetra's barn and you cross the threshold into Raven's Gulch. Something is different. Otherworldly. You've stepped back into time to 1900. People act strangely. People talk strangely. You are not in the modern day any longer. You now belong to the Gulch. This is the effect that we should be striving for. In this class, I will be discussing what life was like in the Victorian West, things to keep in mind while portraying a character from Raven's Gulch, and some popular terms of the time that we can use to help solidify the illusion that our customers have just traveled back to a bygone era. This class is mostly a history lesson, but I think that this is all good information for each of you to know as denizens of Raven's Gulch to help bring an air of realism to our show. Some quick early dates to set up our story. 1845 is going to be our first point that we go back to. Manifest destiny came about and became a popular notion. This is the idea that the United States is destined by God, its advocates believed, to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. Up until this point, America pretty much ended at the Mississippi River, right at St. Louis. That's what the big arch is about there in St. Louis. That was the gateway to the West because that was your last stop of civilization before you entered the wildlands. 1848, so just a few years after this concept of manifest destiny, gold is discovered in Sutter Hill, California. Nobody really cared about moving out west that much until after this happened. And once it happened, everybody wanted to go out west because they were going to strike it rich. Hi, Ben. Come on in and grab a seat. 1862, the Homestead Act passes, accelerating the settlements of Western Territory by granting adult heads of families 160 acres of surveyed public land for a minimal filing fee and 5 years of continuous residence on that land. Then in 1865, the Civil War ends. Many Confederates move out west to recapture their freedom. Many of those become the famous Wild West outlaws that we hear about even today. Jesse James and the James Gang, for example, are exactly this example of Confederate soldiers who didn't like the idea that their side didn't win the war and they weren't going to get to live their way anymore. So they came out west where there were no laws and there were none of this, Western society or Eastern society in America. And they decided to live the way that they wanted to live. That's where we get the term the Wild West. 1869, 4 years after the Civil War ends, Transcontinental Railroad is completed. And now you don't have to take a donkey or a covered wagon across trails to get out west. You can just hop on a train and make it in just a couple of months. Life in the Victorian West. A homestead at last. Many Eastern families who longed for the opportunity to own and farm a plot of land of their own were able to realize their dreams when Congress passed the Homestead Act in 1862. That landmark piece of legislation provided 160 acres free to any family who lived on the land for 5 years and made improvements. The same amount could be obtained instantly for the paltry sum of $1.25 per acre. Combined with the completed Transcontinental Railroad, it was now possible for an Easterner yearning for the open space of the West to make it happen. Unfortunately, the lives they found were fraught with hardship. Perhaps the main thing to know about this topic, especially with respect to the image the cinema has ingrained in us over the decades, is that for the average farmer, rancher, storekeeper, stockman, craftsman, Indian tribesman, etc., life varied from a hard scrabble existence to just plain hard work, depending on one's resources. If you could afford to hire help, it was a bit easier, but never was it actually easy. The bandits and outlaws of the movies were a risk, but probably not as big of a risk as portrayed in the movies themselves. They were more common in various scarcely settled areas, sometimes referred to as the Badlands, where they like to stay away from the law. And we still hear about the Badlands of South Dakota right here in Colorado, because that wasn't that far from here. So that was a place where the outlaws could run away and hide from the law after doing whatever they decided they wanted to do, and nobody was going to come catch them there. Victorian values dominated American social life for much of the 19th century. These values stressed religion, morality, evangelicism, so not only having the religion but spreading it to other people, industrial work ethic, and personal improvements. That was the heyday of the temperance movement, which we will be bringing back this year, actually, our temperance workers. They are going to be restationed now next to the front of the saloon so that the saloon operator stands out and tries to get customers to come in and drink. Well, I have two abolitionists, not abolitionists, what are they called? Temperance workers, teetotalers, that's one of the words. But anyway, yeah, so they'll be standing right next to the door, doing basically the act that you guys used to do back there on Wayne's porch. So I just moved it over to the saloon where it made a little bit more sense. So the temperance movement is a social movement promoting temperance or complete abstinence from consumption of alcoholic beverages. Participants in the movement typically criticize alcohol intoxication or promote teetotalism, which is the principle or practice of complete abstinence from alcoholic drinks. And its leaders emphasize alcohol's negative effects on people's health, personalities, and family lives. The movement scored an impressive early victory in 1880 when the state of Kansas voted for prohibition. Enforcing the law proved more difficult, however, and the women of the temperance movement spent decades trying to get the authorities to live up to the letter of the law. The notion of separate spheres of life for men and women was commonplace. The male sphere included wage work and politics, while the female sphere involved child rearing and domestic work. Working class women often worked in the sewing trades or as domestic servants. Many also took in work at home, such as doing laundry, plaiting straws for hats and fans, or stitching fabric uppers for shoes. Memoirs of growing up in the era emphasize the high moral tone, the centrality of church-going, and the intense educational expectations placed on the community's children. Very often, the first wooden building in a township would be a schoolhouse, which might double as a church or a community center until other specialized buildings could be constructed. A common understanding at the time was that unlike men, women were selfless by nature and therefore well suited to work as school teachers, bringing manners, morals, and culture, typically for very little to no pay, to an area that might otherwise sink into barbarism. In 1870, about half the nation's children received no formal education whatsoever. Although many states provided a free public education for children between the ages of 5 and 21, economic realities kept many children working in mines, factories, or on the farm. Only 6 states had compulsory education laws at this point, and most of them were only a few weeks per year. How did the typical Westerner make a living? Although migrant settlers had skills too numerous to mention, the most dominant Western industries were mining, ranching, and farming. Pretend you're walking around outside, and you come across a quarter lying on the ground. When you bend down to pick it up, you notice another quarter, just a few inches from the first. Intrigued, you start looking more closely, picking up rocks and digging into the ground a little. In just a few minutes, you have a pocket full of change and a lot of excitement. You try to keep the news to yourself, but little by little, word gets out. Some people are coming from all around to dig in the spot where you found the quarters. Some people go home empty-handed, but others find a fortune. This was the scenario miners from the 1800s found themselves in. Bonanza! That was the exclamation when a large vein of valuable ore was discovered. Thousands of optimistic Americans and even a few foreigners dreamed of finding a bonanza and retiring at a very young age. 10 years after the 1849 California gold rush, new deposits were gradually found throughout the West. Colorado yielded gold and silver at Pikes Peak in 1859 and at Leadville in 1873. Towns built around gold and silver rushes were inherently unstable. Denver, for example, was a town of only a few dozen people in 1858. When gold was found, the city's population grew to 7,000 in less than a year. When the rush subsided, Denver transformed itself into a supply center for mining communities throughout the Rockies, and later as a railroad hub. So that's where we came from. That's why we're here. Life in the goldfields exposed miners to loneliness and homesickness, isolation and physical danger, bad food and illness, and even death. More than anything, mining was hard work. Fortune might be right around the corner, but so too was failure. Gold miners woke before daylight 6 days a week, most of them likely dressed in the dark, pulling on a pair of Levi's before heading to the mines. Levi's were sturdy pants made from tent canvas by a man named Levi Strauss. Strauss had started selling them when the miners complained that their pants wore out too quickly. Later, Strauss switched to denim and used copper rivets to make the pockets stronger. Levi's are still sold today, and you might even own a pair yourself. Miners also wore long-sleeve shirts, sometimes called trapper shirts, probably because they were first worn by fur trappers. Most miners only owned 1 or 2 sets of clothing. They wore the same clothes every day, waiting until the old ones were literally falling apart before buying a new set. After drinking a cup of coffee and eating a hard biscuit, miners were ready for work. The home they left behind for the day was not much to speak of. For some, it was just a tent. Others lived in hastily constructed shanties. Whatever shelter they had, most miners slept on a pile of old blankets or furs on the floor. Aside from their clothing and tools, miners usually owned only a frying pan, a few utensils, a coffee pot, and a tin plate. Full of hope, a miner shouldered his pick and shovel in the morning and headed out to dig. Each miner had his own section of land in which to dig, called his claim. Gold diggers spent 12 to 16 hours a day digging, scraping, hauling, and washing dirt and gravel. The work was repetitive and backbreaking. Miners worked 6 days a week, but on the 7th, they also headed for town. Town was teeming with miners, shops, saloons, laundries, and plenty of people to go meet. While in town, miners first went to the bank, where they exchanged their gold for money. On the trips to town, when supplies were needed, a miner had to be careful how he spent his money. Because business was booming, merchants often raised their prices. A loaf of bread that sold for 22 cents in St. Louis could cost $2 in San Francisco. A horse could be purchased for $6 most places, but miners were smart to buy one before they reached California, where horses cost $300. So they had inflation even back then, same as us. Rubbing elbows with so many other miners was always interesting because the gold diggers were sometimes very different from one another. Some had been farmers or merchants before they headed out towards California. Others had been doctors or preachers. Women also tried their hand at mining, though they were more likely to cook, run boarding houses, or sell supplies. At first, many different ethnic groups worked together to mine for gold. Mines often had workers from the United States, China, and Mexico, as well as Native Americans working in them. Some enslaved African Americans were even able to make enough money to buy their freedom. Later, when the gold got harder to find, people were desperate to find more, and some resorted to violence. Chinese and Native American miners in particular faced discrimination. They had their claims stolen or were forced to work for white miners. Some were even killed. Lawlessness became a big problem during the gold rush days. People got into fights and often gambled away any money that they had made. Murder and violence were all too common. But despite the crime, a miner could still enjoy some frontier entertainment without breaking any laws. Sometimes a musician would play the banjo for the camp, or a traveling theater group might perform a play on a stage made of packing crates. All in all, there was one major ingredient needed to succeed as a miner: luck. No matter how many hours a prospector spent shoveling dirt, he could not make up for a claim that just did not have that much gold. For the quick-witted, however, failing as a gold miner did not always mean going broke. In fact, many people made their fortunes by supplying the miners with goods and services instead of actually digging themselves. Chances were, however, that if a miner pinned all his hopes on hitting pay dirt, he ended up disappointed. When the gold rush subsided around 1852, billions of dollars of gold had been removed from the ground and many lives had been changed, for better or worse. Ranching. Let's talk about the second major branch of work that they would do. In the mid-1800s, the United States built railroads that reached further west, and cowboys played a central part in the nation's manifest destiny, which we covered at the beginning, as westward expansion led to an ever-shifting frontier. A cowboy is an animal herder who tends cattle on ranches in North America, traditionally on horseback, and often performs a multitude of other ranch-related tasks. The historic American cowboy of the late 19th century arose from the vaquero traditions of northern Mexico and became a figure of special significance and legend. Cowboys were mostly young men who needed cash. The average cowboy in the West made about $25 to $40 a month. In addition to herding cattle, they also helped care for horses, repaired fences and buildings, worked cattle drives, and in some cases helped establish frontier towns. They were not always welcome as they traveled, as they had reputations of being drunk, disorderly, and even violent. To distinguish what cattle belonged to which ranch, cowboys would brand the animals by burning a special mark into their hides. It took between 8 and 12 cowboys to move 3,000 herd of cattle along the cattle drives. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, the Union Army had largely used up the supply of beef in the North, increasing the demand for beef. The expansion of the meatpacking industry also encouraged consumption of beef. By 1866, millions of heads of longhorn cattle were rounded up and driven toward the railroad depots. Cattle were sold to northern markets for as much as $40 per head. Ranching continued to be widespread throughout the late 1800s. While settlers were permitted to claim public lands on the Great Plains as open range to raise purchased cattle. The way cowboys dressed helped them manage in harsh working conditions. Most infamously, they wore boots that had pointed toes, called cowboy boots, to easily slip in and out of the stirrups. This was critical as it was common to fall off a horse, which could be life-threatening, since a delay in getting out of the stirrups could lead to being dragged by the horse. There were multiple functions of the cowboy hat. The brim protected them from the sun. The high crown allowed it to be a cup for water, and when folded over, it could even be used as a pillow. Cowboys would also often wear bandanas to protect them from the dust kicked up by cattle. And lastly, chaps worn by many cowboys helped protect them from sharp bushes, cactus, and other plants that they encountered in the plains and on cattle drives. Back at the ranch, the work days were just as long and the living conditions worse than out on the range. The cowboys and ranch hands shared a small bunkhouse, which was drafty and leaked in the rain. It was cold in winter and stiflingly hot in summer. The beds were plagued with lice. Then there was the smell. Imagine a room full of men who'd been working hard with horses and cows all day long. They might wash once a week in the summer if there was a lake or stream nearby or a tub big enough to bathe in. Otherwise, they just wouldn't bother. In the wintertime, most would not even think about it until the spring. For entertainment, some sang songs, played the guitar or harmonica, easy for me to say, and wrote poetry. Cowboys were referred to as cowpokes, buckaroos, cowhands, and cowpunchers. The most experienced cowboy was called the segundo, which is Spanish for second, and rode squarely with the trail boss. Everyday work was difficult and laborious for cowboys. Workdays lasted about 15 hours, and much of that time was spent on a horse or doing other physical labor. The cowboys' work year centered on two big events, the roundup and the long drive. Roundups were held in the spring and often also in the fall. After cowboys had herded cattle to a central location, they branded the newborn calves, castrated and dehorned older animals, and in the spring chose the cattle to be taken to market. From 1865 to 1880, at least 3.5 million cattle were driven in herds between 1,500 and 3,000 from southern Texas to cattle towns on rail lines in Kansas, Nebraska, and Wyoming. Working up to 20 hours a day, cowboys drove the animals from one watering place to the next. They had to guard against predators, both two and four-footed, straying cattle, and stampedes at night. Few ranchers in the American West faced labor shortages. For green kids, college graduates, immigrants, and sundry other men always seemed willing to try their hand at cowboying. Ranchers could impose restrictions on their hands, such as forbidding gambling or drinking, and make them stick. Any grumblers or violators could be replaced quickly and easily with other men. Joseph Nemo in 1886 recorded that organization, discipline, and order characterized the new undertakings on the northern ranges. The northern cattle industry made cowboys less independent and more akin to other regimented workers of their time. The supposedly wild, hard-riding Texas cowboy gave way to the responsible, loyal ranch hands. Cowboys were no paragons of virtue, as many romantics and popularizers would have us believe. Nor were they the uncouth barbarians of the plains, described by self-anointed spokesmen of civilization and culture. Externalities, principally the law and employers, imposed restrictions that shaped their lives. But cowboys lived as much as possible by their own internal codes of conduct. The cardinal virtues for the American cowboy were to do his best to be cheerful, courageous, uncomplaining, helpful, and chivalrous. But of course, few cowboys maintain these ideals at all times in their lives. Honesty, a man's word as his bond, is also associated with the cowboy in the popular mind. But examples exist of cowboy indifferences to the truth and to the rights of others. A diary kept by Prairie Davis describes a trail drive from South Dakota to Texas in 1894. David notes that in Wyoming they passed, quote, a nice stream through a pasture where they charged $20 for watering a herd. Watered before anybody sees us. No pay. A little further along, their horses ran through a fence. Didn't pay for the fence, records Davis. In fact, his trail crew committed so many misdemeanors that they became notorious. In northern Colorado, the boss of the 7D outfit passed the crew Davis worked with and, quote, says he's glad to get ahead because we left a hard name for everyone, and everyone was watching him whenever he stopped, fearing he would steal fence posts or water, just like we did. In 1867, Lucian B. Smith invents barbed wire, which Joseph F. Glidden will modify in 1874, leading to the taming of the West and the end of the cowboys. By about 1890, much of the range had been fenced. The westward extension of the railroads eliminated the need for the log cattle drives, and the good old days of epic drives and open range riding came to an end. At this point, however, dime novels, Wild West shows, and books, such as Owen Wister's The Virginian from 1902, offered the nostalgia public a stalwart, romantic cowboy hero. Although far removed from the drab truth, the image of excitement, freedom, and drama continues to dominate popular accounts of the cattle frontier. Moving on to the third major branch, farming. Indigenous settlers in the 1860s and 1870s worked out how to live without wood for buildings or fire. The plains were covered with hundreds of millions of buffalo chips, the desiccated remains of buffalo dung, which early settlers used to make fire. Many settlers built sod houses out of the prairie grasses on which they trod. In areas where wood was available, one of the first things a farmer needed to do was to build a barn and a cabin. The barn was important to keep the animals safe from wolves and other predators, and to also store farming tools and grain. Typically, the barn and the cabin were made from logs in a fashion that didn't need any nails. Homestead farmers often specialized in a single crop, typically either corn or wheat. They would sell their crop on the market and use the proceeds to buy everything else they needed. It was common for families to live for a year or two in a sod house, then use the profits of their farm to import wood to build a proper house. They would also buy tools as well as the various household goods associated with respectability. Farm families all had to work hard. Farming was a seasonal activity, and they usually had to put their cash into seeds and supplies or borrow ahead against next year's crop. It cost between $500 and $750 to start a 150-acre farm. Throughout the 19th century, most Americans had little cash, and farmers, domestic help, and laborers alike all worked long hours, typically 6 days per week and 10 hours per day. The typical farmer rose with the sun, tended the animals, worked the fields, broke bread with the family, and then retired when the sun went down. With the exceptions of the Sabbath and holiday observations, life remained constant, changing only with the seasons. As long as the father of the family was alive, he crafted everything: buildings, furniture, tools, shoes, belts, etc. He and his family grew everything, including medicinal herbs and materials that could be used in clothing. Planting the seed on a farm took a lot of work. First, the farmer would need to plow up the field with a large plow pulled by a horse or an oxen. Next, he would scatter the seeds through the field, and finally he would use the oxen or the horse to drag dirt over the tops of the seeds. On the Great Plains, very few single men attempted to operate a farm or a ranch. Farmers clearly understood the need for a hardworking wife and numerous children to handle the many chores, including child rearing, feeding and clothing the family, managing the housework, and feeding the hired hands. During the early years of settlement, farm women played an integral role in ensuring family survival by working outdoors. But after a generation or so, women increasingly left the fields, thus redefining their roles within the family. New conveniences, such as sewing and washing machines, encouraged women to turn to domestic roles. The scientific housekeeping movement, promoted across the land by the media and government extension agents, as well as county fairs which featured achievements in home cookery and canning, advice columns for women in the farm papers, and home economics courses in the schools, all contributed to this trend. While men would spend most of their day hunting and tending the farm, women would gather plants, prepare and preserve food, and complete other household chores. Surviving winter required preserving adequate food. Fruits would need to be canned, a process that took hours. Meat would either need to be salted or brined, meaning it would have to be painstakingly cleaned before consumption, or smoked, requiring stoking a fire for weeks. Tending fires took much of pioneer women's days, as keeping it going hot enough required constant adjustment. Other women's tasks often included making soap from lye, water, and ashes from the fireplace, spinning wool into yarn or flax into thread, tending a garden so the family had a variety of vegetables to eat and not just their main cash crop, and sewing and repairing the family's clothes. Other chores women were expected to do included cleaning and caring for animals. No pioneers had sewing machines, so clothing needed to be constructed and mended by hand. Laundry had to be done with a tub and a washboard, and there were no conveniences such as vacuums or running water to make cleaning easier. Milking the cows, mucking the barn, and feeding the animals could take hours and tended to be unpleasant work. There were no breaks or vacations and little time for luxuries. Days were spent slogging through chores, knowing that tomorrow would only bring new chores to be completed. Although the Eastern image of farm life on the prairie emphasizes the isolation of the lonely farmer in farm life, in reality, rural folk created a rich social life for themselves. They often sponsored activities that combined work, food, and entertainment, such as barn raisings, corn huskings, quilting bees, grange meetings, church activities, and school functions. The women folk organized shared meals and potluck events, as well as extended visits between families. Isolation on the plains meant that farm families did have to make their own fun. Reading and music offered good sources of home entertainment. Guitars, fiddles, harmonicas, and other musical instruments provided amusement. Musicians enjoyed a warm welcome at occasional dances, which families might travel for hours to attend. A quilting bee produced needed bedding and offered women a break from the isolation of plains life. Holidays provided a chance to socialize and celebrate. Laura Abramson described fun at a 4th of July celebration in South Dakota in 1895. She said, "We had swings and hammocks and played games and had lemonade and cake and had so much fun at the picnic that I guess I'll feel all right even if I don't do anything now for a long time." People were close to nature and generally understood it better than we do now, except for modern experts. Life was quieter on expansive frontiers, and even in towns with little background noise outside the bigger cities and towns. No radio, TV, or stereo played in the backgrounds in your house. Families and friends relaxed with dances, sing-alongs, parlor games, and outdoor games. Baseball became popular during the Civil War and surely went west. Laura Ingalls Wilder, author of Little House on the Prairie series, which this class was named after, wrote that the constant blowing wind on the prairie where she spent most of her life before moving to Missouri after marriage. There were no highlands to stop it. Also, people of that era, even on eastern farms, made many of their own products. Although the pioneers worked most of the time, they would occasionally get together for a dance or a picnic. Sometimes people would gather together to help with a big job, such as building a neighbor's barn. Once the barn was finished, they would have a dance. They played fiddles and accordions for music. Children had fun playing games outdoors, exploring, and swimming. They didn't get a lot of store-bought toys, so they had to make their own. Girls would learn to practice their sewing by making their own dolls to play with. Other popular pastimes included sledding, berry picking, swimming, and fishing. Travel. In the West, distances were great. There was no air conditioning in vehicles or homes, and all travel was by foot, horse, mule, oxen, or mule-drawn wagon, horse-drawn carriages, or train. Rail travel could be dirty in warm weather when the windows on the passenger cars were open. The smoke from the smokestacks of the coal-burning engines would blow in. As railroads moved across the Great Plains through farming country, towns were typically established at regular intervals. The aim was to space these new towns such that no farmer would be more than a day's ride away by wagon. Some railroads merely followed the alphabet as they selected names. The Burlington and Missouri River Railroad, for example, sequentially founded Crete, Dorchester, Exeter, Fairmount, Grafton, Hastings, Ingleside, and Juanita as it built new lines across Nebraska. So it just went A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Railroad towns became local trade centers. The general store was usually the first business to be built and would be sited near the railroad depot. Other early businesses were the livery stable and the blacksmith's workshop, which were as ubiquitous in horse-based communities as gas stations and garages are today. Banks came next, and if all went well, workshops and factories would follow. Other jobs other than the big three which you could choose for your character include bounty hunter, oil baron, business owner or manager, freight hauler, which would be a delivery driver, hotel keeper, lumberjack, hunter, mountain man, store clerk, bartender, gunsmith, ranch hand, apothecary, which would be their version of a pharmacist back in those days, a preacher, athlete, carriage driver, carriage security. You can just kind of go through and look at the rest of these and just sort of see that, you're not just shoehorned into the big three just because those were the biggest things that most people did. There were all different kinds of jobs that needed to be done around this part of country in 1900. And I do believe if you're a woman, there's the top jobs in 1900 in this part of the country that women did. So cowgirl, teacher, fancy lady, which basically means you were rich, from a rich family and didn't have to work. Fallen lady, prostitute. Saloon girl, artist, cook, wet nurse, somebody who nurses somebody else's babies for them. A nanny, a photographer, a tonsorial artist, which was their name for a hairdresser back in the day. A midwife, musician, author, dance instructor, a museum or menagerie caretaker, a bone collector, telegraph operators, hello girls, which would be the switchboard operators, typewriter girls, harness and shop saddle maker, phrenologist, using bumps on people's heads to give a psychological profile, which that one's pretty fun. That's been proven to be a pseudoscience now, but back in the day it was pretty popular for somebody to look at somebody's head and be like, oh yeah, you have a bump right there and a bump right there. Oh, you're a serial killer. We need to arrest you and put you in jail. And they would, because they thought that was a science. The bumps on your head would tell you what kind of person you were. So it was very bizarre, but it's what they believed back then. Timeline of inventions in the 1800s. let me just hit a few. I'll let you guys read through everything, but I just want to hit a few of the highlights that kind of apply to us a little bit more than the others. 1867. Did you get everybody get a picture of that one? Because I'm going to move to the next screen. There we go. 1867. Lucian B. Smith invents barbed wire, which Joseph F. Glidden will modify in 1874, leading to the taming of the West and the end of the cowboys. Did I have a question? Yeah, Daniel. Sure.
Just like people kind of looking at timeline dimensions, just because it was invented didn't mean it was commonplace for the everyday.
Exactly. And keep in mind, too, that a lot of these inventions were invented way out east in New York or Chicago, places like that. It took a long time for some of that stuff. Even today, trends and things will start on the coast, and then it takes a little while for it to get here in Colorado. So even though we're set in 1900, it's not out of the realm of possibility to keep your inventions and your things like that, maybe more like the 1880s, 1870s, something like that. Because we're not here in Colorado going to be on the very cutting edge of technology, I'll tell you that. Certainly not in these Wild West towns like what Ravens Gulch is. I thought this one was interesting. 1880, which is on the next screen here. The British Perforated Paper Company debuts toilet paper. People didn't even have toilet paper until 1880. That's only 140 years ago. That's not that long. So I thought that one was kind of interesting. 1884, Hiram Maxim invents the recoil-operated Maxim gun, ushering in the age of semi and fully automatic firearms. So, if you're an anti-gun person, you can be mad at him. He invented the best one. Let's see, moving on. Things that do not exist yet and should not be mentioned in Ravens Gulch. 1903, so we're set in 1900. 1903, they flew the first airplane. So don't be mentioning airplanes, air travel, anything like that. It didn't exist yet. 1909, the first television broadcast. And 1926, the first live working television system. So nobody had television until 20 some odd years after when we're set. So keep that in mind. Your characters have no idea what television programs are or what a television is. 1933, FM radio comes along. 1956, the hard disk drive is invented by IBM. So basically, we just need to keep away from anything that involves computers, modern cars, planes, and the concept of easy travel. Like, you guys know what the concept of easy travel is. You can get on a train and you can go clear across the country in only 4 months. That's amazing. That's super easy, because compared to what they had before that, it was. But compared to us being able to get on a plane and get there in 3 hours, that would blow their minds. But just keep those things in mind when you're thinking of character concepts or when you're thinking of things to talk about to the customers, because none of this stuff exists. If they come through and they say, hey, yo, what's your Snapchat? What's a Snapchat? What's a cell phone? You guys should have no idea what these things are, because they didn't come along for years and years after this town was set. Moving on here. If you would like to just take one and pass those down, I made everybody a copy of this entire glossary that I'm going to go over here, but I have kind of farmed some interesting terms and phrases that were popular during the day. Hi, Richard. We'll go through here. Above board means in open sight without artifice or trick. These contracts appear to be above board. Ace in the hole. Acknowledge the corn. For my character, I'm probably going to use that one, honestly, being the corn man. Addle-headed. We can talk about stupid people by calling them addle-headed. You're empty-headed. You're not smart. We're going to have us a hog killing time. A real good time. Anybody working in either the bar or the saloon area, you can refer to Applejack. Let's see here. I've got bad medicine for you. Means I got some bad news I'm about to tell you. Hobble your lip. Shut up. Same thing with bellyache. Quit your belly aching. I don't want to hear no belly aching in here. Exactly. Bucket of Blood, a violence-prone frontier saloon. So if anybody knows about our saloon in town, maybe it's the Bucket of Blood. It's a place where if you get in there, you're going to get in a fight and somebody's going to kill you. But the more of these, and I'm not saying that you guys have to memorize this entire thing and everybody use this thing, but pick one or two or three of these that kind of speak to you and try to incorporate them into some of your dialogue. And if they hear enough of us using these weird words and terms that people don't use anymore, it's going to make the customers feel like we're talking a foreign language to them. It's going to make them feel like they are somewhere other that they don't quite understand. A lot of these are kind of common sense, but some of them, you're going to throw people for a loop. They're not going to know what you're saying. Keep your pig stickers off of me. That kind of thing. What in the Sam Hill? Why are you yammering? Why are you yammering? You yellow belly coward. So yeah, the more of these terms you can work in your character's vocabulary and make them sound natural and believable, which will come with a little bit of practice, the more it will help sell the otherness of Raven's Gulch to our guests. If you've ever been to the Renaissance Festival, then you have a general idea where I would like to go with this concept. Instead of huzzah and prithee, however, we'll use afeard and balderdash to help us sell our time period. Keep all of this in mind when developing your character for the haunt, as well as during operation. Incorporate these concepts into your character's concepts, and you can always adjust your already developed characters to make them more period appropriate. One last thing I want to go here. For people who need help finding a name for their character, I got this again. It's all the most popular names from 1900. Both male and female will be on that list. Some of them are very cool and interesting. America was a popular name for a girl back then. Josephine, Judith, Taylor, Judith, you were exactly right there. But yeah, so if you need to refer to somebody, let's say you're just making up a character that doesn't even exist, and you're going to refer to, my brother who's just right over there, but the customers will never actually see that person. This will at least give you an idea for how to, pick a name that's period appropriate for what we're trying to do. So make sure that you get a copy of that. That pretty well covers what I was going to discuss. Does anyone have any questions for me? Anybody? Questions?
So I had looked up names.
Yeah?
And
Constance is one of them. And that happens to be your actual name.
Well, it's
close enough.
Goofy version of my name.
Close enough. Yeah, exactly.
So I'm kind of wondering, or is it too close to my real name? So we have to keep things separate.
You don't have to keep things separate. It's not like you're a stripper and you're trying to keep people from following you home, so you need a false identity. We're not in that type of situation. You can use your real name if you want, and no one will bother you. Anybody else have any questions? Can somebody tell me? Oh, Danny.
This season, is it like a specific year, so a couple years?
Compared to last year, you're saying? Oh, so our specific year is set at 1900. 1900, exactly 1900. That's the year that we're set. As far as how that plays off versus last year, I'm kind of playing that fast and loose. Like, there are things that happened last year that I am incorporating into our story. Like the plague that came and infested the entire gypsy camp. And they almost all died of plague because the witch put a terrible plague out across the city. When in reality, all my gypsies just got sick and it was a problem. Anybody else have any questions? Can somebody tell me what time it is?
We're like 2 hours early. It's 4:47.
It's 4:47. Yes. All right, guys. Thank you all for coming out. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
I'll be around if anybody thinks of any other questions, but thank you for coming out to my class.